The Fertility Friday podcast is supported by the monthly women's kit by Dow Labs. Dow Labs is making Chinese herbal medicine more approachable, convenient, tasty, and accessible. Head over to mydowlabs.com and use the code Fertility for 20% off your first order. Again, that's mydowlabs.com, mydao-labs.com. This is the Fertility Friday podcast, episode number 196. Welcome to the 196th episode of the Fertility Friday podcast. Thank you for joining me today. I'm Lisa from fertilityfriday.com, and this is your source for information about the fertility awareness method and all things fertility. I've got a great episode for you today. I'm really excited to share it with you. So in today's episode, I welcome Diana Thomas to the show. Now, Diana has a really interesting story because her own fertility challenges led her to create an egg donor agency. And so in today's episode, we're actually going to be talking about that and also talking about egg donation and how it all works. And one of the interesting things about our conversation is to get that frame of reference for how far we've come. So how different things were 10, 15 years ago, or even longer. Now, it's interesting to think about how much things have changed since, in the last couple of decades. What I'm interested to know is how things are going to change for the future. So, of course, if you've been listening to the show for a while, you know that I cannot stop talking about fertility awareness to the point that I created a podcast, and I've been going on about it for 3 years. I was about to say 2, but it's 3 years, and nearly 200 episodes later, I still haven't run out of things to say about it. So I'm curious to see what's going to happen in the coming decades, and I want to live to see the day where fertility awareness is mainstream, and it's just something that we all can take for granted, and our daughters and sons can take for granted, that everyone just knows this and it's considered to be a valid and effective form of birth control, which it is, but it's kind of unbeknownst to the majority of the world right now that it actually is an effective and science-backed method. So it's interesting to think about where we've come, but I'm very interested to see where we'll go. And so if you've recently discovered fertility awareness, one of the things I hear a lot from my clients, from my listeners, is just that, there's often not a lot of people in your immediate circle who get it and who support you. I mean, sometimes if you're fortunate, there are people in your life who will support you, but many people don't understand. They don't really get why you're doing this. They don't think it's effective. You may have had an interesting experience with a healthcare provider, such as a doctor or another healthcare provider, who really kind of dissuades you from using it because they're not really informed of the actual effectiveness and how it works. So if you're, wanting some additional support to make sure that you can really master this method and use it effectively for whatever your intentions are. So whether you're wanting to really effectively use this as your primary method of birth control, or whether you're trying to conceive and you really want to dive into what's happening in your cycle and get a better sense of what's going on, and what you can learn from your menstrual cycle, your fifth vital sign, then make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/work-with-me. There's a lot of different ways to work with me. I teach fertility awareness charting, and I support women to really understand the connection between their menstrual cycle and their overall health. And so it's really exciting because there's two huge pieces to this puzzle. One is getting down the charting and being really, really comfortable and confident, like which day is a fertile day, which day is not, like it's black and white. So I teach you how to do that and to feel really confident about it. But then the second part is to see what information we can gather from your charts. And so this is, my area of specialization. And I love to support women to decode their menstrual cycles and to really get a sense of what information they can derive about their overall health and fertility from their cycles. So make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/work-with-me for more information about how I can support you to really master fertility awareness and gain confidence in using this method, so that when someone asks you if it's effective, you don't feel like you just feel confident because you're using it and it's working, and you've had the support that you need to really develop the skills that you need to chart effectively. And before we jump into today's episode, let's take a moment to thank our sponsor, Dow Labs. Herbal medicine is an integral part of Chinese medicine. Herbs have been used for centuries for a variety of treatments, which is why they're still used today. And in their purest form, herbs are typically boiled and concentrated and then consumed. And while they can be incredibly effective, they typically don't taste that great. And so, with that in mind, Dow Labs has developed the Women's Monthly Kit as a way to gently bring the menstrual cycle back in balance. So the Women's Monthly Kit is made up of a classic combination of two incredibly popular and powerful formulas, emotional balance and women's formulas. And together, these formulas support hormonal balance and cycle regularity, and they actually taste pretty great. The formulas have a slight carbonation, so they're actually quite refreshing, and you don't have to boil anything or do anything or prepare anything. They come ready to go. So they come in pre-portioned packets, and all you have to do is pour them into a glass of water, give it a little stir, and you're good to go. So for more information, make sure to head over to mydowlabs.com and be sure to use the code Fertility at checkout to receive 20% off of your first order. So again, that's mydowlabs.com. And again, use the code Fertility at checkout to receive 20% off your first order. Now let's jump into today's episode. And today I'm very excited to welcome my guest, Diana Thomas, to the show. Diana is the founder and CEO of the World Egg Bank. After successfully becoming pregnant herself, fertility specialists began approaching Diana and asking her for help in finding egg donors for their own patients. She quickly discovered that there was a desperate need for a company that understood empowering recipients with information about egg donors and the emotional sensitivity to navigate through the process of involving another person in their reproductive life. Through her own personal experience, she created a company that catered to the personal needs of intended parents, as well as brought the best quality care to the egg donors. And so in today's episode, we're going to be talking about Diane's personal journey and essentially what led her to create the World Egg Bank. And we're also going to be talking about egg donations. So I'm really excited to have her today. So without further ado, welcome to the show, Diana.
Well, thank you very much. I'm glad to be here.
Well, I really appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today. And I'd love just to start by getting a sense of your own history and your own story, essentially the events leading up to your decision to create the World Egg Bank.
Sure. It's a long story and I'll make it short, but basically I started in infertility at age 25 when I couldn't get pregnant. And I think I went through the same stages that most people go through. I had my master's degree. I had my first big job, professional job. I was married, the white picket fence and everything was there except the baby. And so I started off on this journey at a time when in the 80s, when infertility was really not talked about and certainly egg donation basically didn't exist. And I started in my infertility treatments in Canada, and then moved to the U.S. later and continued it then. So I was on about a 15-year journey through infertility, learning as I went along in an industry that was itself learning what was going on, trying to find their own ways. And it seems as though I kind of hit the whole IVF arena when it was one new thing after another every couple of months. And I've sort of felt a bit like an experiment for 15 years. And I do remember after 10 years of and going through IVFs and IUIs and endoscopic surgeries and all sorts of things, laparoscopies, that I was told I needed an egg donor for the best chance to have a child. I was shocked and didn't know what that was, and nobody could really tell me what it was about. So, I found that 2 places in the U.S. that had been doing it, and I'm talking a few times a year. I certainly could not afford the only donor agency that was open in those days out of L.A., which was called Options, I think, especially after 15 years of going through these treatments. There are all different levels. I'm kind of talking about medically, the sort of the stress I went through and the changes and all of the different technologies that came along the way. And we were still doing intramuscular injections. And I remember the retrievals were without sedation. It was way back when. And, as any woman who wants to have a child and is determined to do so, you just accept what's handed you at the time. And certainly I did that and did a lot of my own research until I decided that my best chance to have a baby was through a donor egg. And at that time, I was about 40. So I went out and advertised for him, found my own egg donor, and just muddled my way through it because there was no guideline. There were no guidelines by ASRM. No one knew how to screen donors. There were no psyche evals on, whether you should tell a donor or not. There were no studies done. I went back to adoption literature and I read about that. And I just decided on my own I was going to be open with my child because I'm pretty transparent anyway. And I didn't want my child to see that I was withholding something from them. So, there were a lot of things I just kind of struggled through with on my own. And I got very lucky in those days. Even with donor eggs, the chances of taking home a baby was about 10%. And I had one of the first 100 babies in the United States with donor eggs. So certainly I know where people are coming from when they're going through this. And I think that the path is much, much easier now. And I don't mean to minimize how horrible it is for people because it is incredibly expensive, emotional process. But I do remember all of the conversations around me that I decided I couldn't tell people what I was doing unless they were really close friends. I was treated a bit freakish for doing something that nobody really heard about. I became pretty discreet about who I talked to, but the guiding light that I always followed was my own belief, my own guts, my own trust in I would know when it was time for me to stop, and it wasn't up to anybody else to decide. So that's kind of the short version. I imagine there's some questions in there, but that's the big picture. It's been a journey, and I don't know if you want me to just keep talking or.
Well, no, I really appreciate you taking us through it. It paints an interesting window, I think. So for me, just so that you have kind of a sense, like I'm 34 years old. It's hard to imagine what things would have been like for you, because from what I read in your bio and everything, you would have been dealing with this in the 80s and then finally actually successfully conceiving in the 90s. Is that
Right.
about right? Yeah. And just the way that you described it, we're in a completely different world now. I mean, I suppose the first question I have for you is maybe you could talk a little bit about how things are now versus how they were then. I mean, now, although we've made so much progress, I can say that it's still not so common. Like it's still not like everybody's doing it and everyone's comfortable with it. But compared to what it would have been like for you, like it's just incredible to think.
I think it's more accepted now, but certainly not broadly accepted. And I don't think that people really even consider it. Not that they accept it or don't accept it, but I don't think people even think about it unless they're the ones being told your best chance of getting pregnant is with donor egg. Mm-hmm. And I think, after a certain age, obviously, but it's so different now. And I think there are some things that have remained constant. Disclosure to children, for example, is much more accepted. In fact, the World Egg Bank that I own was the first egg bank in the world, actually, and I started that in 2004 after finding donors for fresh donor cycles for 15 years. So I certainly know that there's so much more information out there. It's almost overwhelming. But there are standards now that people can count on for donor screening, for psychological evaluations, for realistic data on what chances are in your circumstances. And all of those things I think are extremely helpful. On the other hand, I think that there's some inconsistency still in the marketplace that people have to be put on their buyer's beware hat. Mm-hmm. And I think patients have a very hard time asking doctors questions because they feel it's challenging them and then they won't get pregnant. So there's all sorts of, superstitious ideas around wanting to become pregnant. And I know that was one of them and one I see fairly frequently. I saw donor agencies come and go almost monthly for almost a decade. I think it's kind of stabilized now, but people were not able to follow through with the increased demands being placed on agencies to screen donors adequately. And I think that, a few have remained that know how to do it. And even in terms of egg banking, I'm the only egg bank in the world that does everything in-house so that I can control quality from start to finish. And it was a longer haul to get that going. But on the other hand, I always did it from a recipient's perspective. And I know if I were a recipient, I wouldn't want so-and-so's clinic retrieving eggs for so-and-so. I mean, you have people all over the place retrieving eggs and you don't even really know how they're being, how experienced the lab is in freezing them. And we actually do everything from donor recruiting, screening, monitoring, stimulation, monitoring, retrieval, egg freezing, and shipping, all from one location with the same staff so that we can actually collect data, know where there are areas we can improve. We monitor every facet of the process, and we have the same people in the lab doing all of our egg freezing every single month. Mm-hmm. And those things don't really get through to recipients as much as I'd like them to, because recipients are used to being out of control in an IVF practice and not really even knowing what questions to ask a lot of times. So I feel like it's our obligation to at least know that we're putting them in a position they don't have to ask us. We're providing the best quality eggs that can be done.
Well, and going back to your story, and so 15 years is a long time. I think that's on the kind of and I'm sure you recognize this, whether it's looking back or when you were in the midst of this. 15 years is quite a long time to be trying to conceive. And yes. So looking back at your experiences, now, of course, so much now, is there anything that you wish you would have known right off the bat?
So much. One of them is, I think people need to realize, is that doctors really don't have all the answers, and there's still so much about the biology of reproduction that remains unknown. And I think that if people were given information about the real risks of engaging in whatever phase they're in IVF or infertility, they need a plan, and they need to know, how far they can stretch their dollars, where they need to go, and they need to know whether they should go from A to C to Z, or whether they should go A, B, C, D, E, F, G. When you plan your finances out in your life for your home or your car, we do that, but we don't do that for infertility. And you can't really account for how much you can take, because every time I was told, we got 17 eggs and none of them fertilized, or, every time something didn't work, it was quite devastating. And I felt like that was the end of it until I regrouped and thought, okay, now what do I have left? And, I wish more of that counseling was available to patients to direct them with a plan. That's one thing I think that could be done now that couldn't be done in my days. There's so much already that's being taken care of through guidelines produced by ASRM that I think that generally patients are given a lot of good information, which also wasn't available to me. But it's very hard, because it really is about not just hoping, but also taking charge and educating yourself, and don't feel like any question is too silly to ask. And fortunately, that's my nature, so I didn't have a problem asking questions. But I think sometimes even when you get the answer, you have to question the answer, because doctors want patients to feel comfortable, and they'll give you answers to the best of their ability instead of saying, this is the answer to the best of my ability, but there's still a lot of unknown factors that I can't answer.
Mm-hmm.
It's just human nature, and I'm not just saying it's about doctors. I think it's true for most professions, but it's really the patient's responsibility to take the reins in their own fertility.
Well, I agree. And that's something that comes across on the podcast a lot because I mean, there's just so many, this is just a really hard, it's just really hard territory. There's a lot of women who are told, this can't happen for you, or this isn't going to be possible. And then they, decide to take the reins and make changes in a natural arena. And after dealing with some things on their own, they're able to conceive naturally where they were told that was not possible. And there are other situations where obviously that doesn't happen. So from your, personal experience, and then also for, keep thinking about the women who are listening, at what point should one consider donor eggs? How do you know if like, you know what I mean? Like, is there a point, or is there a certain kind of way to look at the situation to know whether or not this is something that one should start to consider?
Well, the thing about all of us accomplished type A women that go into fertility and are really dogged enough to pursue it, I think that it's very much an internal perspective. You have to decide how much you can take, how far you want to go. But there's information that's pretty black and white about, the chances of having a baby over 40 are, 2%. And you can say, well, I could be one of those 2%, but what are you going to do when you're 45 and that's still going on? I think you have to make your own boundaries, set your own limits, and really be objective about what you're working with.
And the 2%, is that specific to IVF outcomes?
No, that's natural.
Okay.
That's if you were trying to have a child naturally. That's just a simple fact of biology that we're born with our eggs and they age, and it's hard to explain. It's like taking a Xerox copy of something and photocopying it, for 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. It just disintegrates as a picture, and your eggs start to denigrate. There's no reversing it. It doesn't matter how healthy you are. You can optimize the egg quality by being in good health and using nutrition, but biology is not, in the big picture, is not a huge mystery when it comes to the aging of eggs. And so you have to decide if you're 40 and you think, I want to try 2 more years and see if I've maximized all of my chances. But you also have to have the data to make sure, that your uterus is normal and you can wait those 2 years. And I believe people should always be gathering information specifically for themselves, on themselves, so they know what they're working with and what their own limits are. I wanted to have more than one child, and I had pretty much tried all the options available to me at that time. I was exercising and looked great and felt great, and it doesn't matter. It's not the age of our body, it's the age of our eggs that matters. So that's kind of the only guidance I can give people. You might get 5 after trying and say, well, I don't feel that strongly about having a child anymore.
Mm-hmm. And so in your case, did you have your first child when you were around the age of 40, or was that your second?
That was my first. And then I went back, had to find another egg donor, and I had twins at 44.
Wow.
With a second egg donor.
That's incredible. Twins at 44.
Yeah. I mean, but I'm one of those people. I mean, the picture you have of me is last year, and I'm 61. It's not how well you take care of yourself. Those eggs I'm afraid to say, I think biology's backwards. If I could go change things and let us have children later in life, I think it'd be a great idea, but it's just not the way it works yet.
Well, and question for you. So for the listeners, and, I run programs where I teach fertility awareness and basically give women that education of how to time sex and like just the very basic stuff that
Mhm.
obviously we should all be aware of. And so in your case, I mean, you were fortunate to conceive after your incredible fertility journey. How many times did you actually have IVF before it worked?
I had I had 5 laparoscopies because in the old days, in the 80s, they thought all infertility was due to endometriosis. I had a very mild case of endometriosis, and I went through 5 laparoscopies. I took something called danazol, which is like Lupron, to suppress the estrogen, the endometriosis production. I did 9 IUIs, 3 IVFs, and in between all of that, there's sperm analysis and other things that were going on with my husband. And there were, it wasn't 15 consistent years. I had to take a couple years break and save up money and emotionally regroup. And I moved from Canada back to the US, and I bought and sold houses. I changed careers. There was, I fortunately lost my father and my brother to cancer. There's all kinds of things that happen in life that you need to focus on at different times. So, but it was, I was doing something every year, but I wasn't every 3 weeks going to doctor's appointments for 15 years.
Hmm. Yeah, no, I like to ask these types of questions because I feel like it gives the picture. So for instance, if you had just met somebody when you were 44 and pregnant with twins, they can have a certain idea in their minds. Like when we see celebrities in the media and they get pregnant at a
Right.
advanced age and we think like, wow, if she can do it, I can do it, but you don't always know the story. So
Yeah.
in your case, obviously there were many, many years of fertility treatments with no success, but in your case, it seems like it was the donor eggs that actually made the biggest difference. So could you talk to us a little bit about that and perhaps why in your case it was the donor eggs that actually made the difference?
Well, again, it's this lack of information about really the fine biology of the egg. All they could tell me was my infertility was unexplained, which of course doesn't sit well with any woman. I can only tell you that I think it's really high fevers I had as an infant, and I was quite ill as an infant. I know that but basically, I'm never going to have an answer, only that my eggs just didn't work. And my uterus was fine, my lining was fine. When ICSI came along, they can force fertilization of the eggs. So fertilization occurred. It was really about finding a good quality egg. And by that time, there may have been other factors. I don't know, but it was the donor egg that made the difference for me.
Hmm. I think it's just it's impossible to imagine for women who haven't kind of gone through that. But I've done a number of episodes. I did an episode with a gentleman named Sheridan Voisey, and it's interesting in that, as you can tell already, because I interviewed him, but he wrote a book called Resurrection Year because him and his partner tried to conceive for 10 years, at which point they decided to stop trying and just kind of just basically live with, just move forward and move
Right.
forward with their lives. And so, what's incredible about that, after doing an interview with him and kind of hearing a little bit about getting a little peek into the heartache and just how difficult it was for them, to think that you continued on your journey for 5 additional years. So, um, it's just,
Yeah.
I can't even
I've been
imagine how
known to
hard that would
be,
have been for you.
and I don't know, it was, I can't tell you, I think my good sense of humor kept me alive for parts of it because, I'll never forget going in the doctor's office the very first time we had any kind of analysis of the sperm done. And we sit down and he says, well, some of your husband's sperm are big headed sperm. And I'm looking at him like, is this a joke? When I'm picturing this bubble this bubble above my head, what a big headed sperm would look like. But I think that part of it is it's a very serious topic, and it's overwhelmingly serious and devastating. And, I think it's about just taking one step at a time and letting yourself feel the disappointment and grief, and knowing that you'll either decide to move on or you won't, but it's not the end of the world. It's just the end of that cycle. Maybe it's the kind of I always do things on more long term with long term vision in mind, and I try to keep a sense of humor about it, and I try to be compassionate and understand that people around me are not going to understand, and I can't expect them to and be mad at them about it. They just aren't going to understand. I remember my best friend in Montreal called me up at 40, and she said, I was so inspired by your efforts to have a child this late in life that we tried, and in 2 months I'm naturally pregnant with twins. And it was so hard to hear that. I wanted to share in her joy, but I had to give myself 3 weeks to just be mad at her about it. And I just think people have to be honest about their feelings and their stories, and yet protect themselves and know they can't expose themselves to people who are not going to be compassionate with them. And if they're ready to accept a dispassionate viewpoint from somebody, whether it's religious or whatever the basis of the comment is, oh gee, my husband just looked at me and I got pregnant, or if God wanted you to have kids, you'd have kids, or whatever people say to you that they think is comfort, you just have to accept. You have to be prepared to just accept that. Or don't say anything.
Yeah, the things people say, right? Can't even deal with the things that come out of people's mouths.
Yeah. And they think they're helping, Sometimes I just think they're helping.
Yeah, it's incredible. One of the things I've talked about a lot on the show when I get into this topic and in fertility, I often kind of take a moment to talk a little bit about, just for everyone listening who's in a supportive role, like how do you talk to somebody who's struggling with infertility? Because like you said, like people think they're helping, but it's like turning the knife. I mean, just more and more with the things that people say. One of in terms of the realities of aging and fertility, so I've done a number of episodes about that. And actually one of the very first episodes I recorded kind of ever was about aging and fertility. And that episode is really interesting. She talked about the different types of procedures. She talked about IVF. She talked about something called IVM, in vitro maturation. And she also talked about just the success rates and things like that. So that's something that's come up a lot in terms of IVF. And so especially even alluding back to when you see a superstar who's in their 40s and getting pregnant, the statistics show that IVF is much less likely to be successful as a woman gets older, especially if she's using her own eggs versus if she uses eggs from a younger donor. And it seems as though the factor one of the bigger factors in determining if this is actually going to stick is the age of the egg, not necessarily the age of the woman. So I'd be interested, in just hearing a little bit more from you about that reality.
Well, you were talking about that, and I realized that there's a whole piece that I haven't even mentioned, and I think that's the idea of the donor egg. I talk about it as though it's kind of it's nothing, but it's a huge thing to people, to be considering the genes of another person as part of their family. And I've done a couple of blogs on, relationships make family, not genes. And I know that one of the obstacles we all face, and grieving, really, I felt like a family member had died when somebody said I couldn't use my own genes. But then I had to ask myself, do I really need a little me, or do I want a baby? And I thought about, every baby comes out an individual. And if you were to go to a grocery store and you divided all the adults from all the children, you might get 20% of them properly matched with parents. But most people don't. They see similarities among us. They're not looking for differences. I think that unknown scares people a bit about, like, I don't want somebody else's genes, or that's too scary. But for me, I knew that I had miscarried a few times in this whole 15-year process as well. So I also had another little piece of information that eggs can implant, but they couldn't continue to develop, which is pretty much an indication that it's the egg and not my uterus. So I really felt as though I was heading in the right direction when I chose to opt for a baby with a donor egg, to give that a try and go down that path. And I had never had any negative information or feedback about my uterine lining not being properly thick enough and the proper layers in it. I don't want to get into clinical information, but I never had any information that my uterus wasn't going to be okay and I couldn't carry the child. So that also encouraged me down that path. But I think I'm at the other end of the tunnel, and I remember looking down the dark tunnel and wondering, what was it? How could I do this? And what would I tell my child? And how would people treat my child? And would it be different? And, you just get through it. You just take each situation one at a time. You don't have to figure out your whole life. Because once that baby starts moving around inside you, there is no doubt in your mind that isn't your child. And I didn't know that feeling was going to occur. You just have to walk into the unknown and trust that you're a loving human being and you want a family and you want relationships that are going to work, and you're going to figure it out.
Do you find that people are still quite resistant to that idea of, introducing someone else's egg? You know what I mean? Like not their quote unquote genetic material. Do you find that that's still a challenge for people to kind of overcome that idea of having a baby that quote unquote isn't yours, even though the baby is yours?
Absolutely. I think it's a natural step for people. It's just kind of shocking news to hear. And I do think some people travel through this very differently, but I'd say in general, I've seen thousands and thousands of couples, and I think that there is a grieving process. You have to grieve the loss of what you imagined that you didn't even know you were imagining as a child. My sister and I we're nothing alike from the same set of genes. And I think people tend to forget that genes are an absolute crapshoot. It's like they really are. And there is no predicting how what two parents are going to create. And I think those are not thoughts that you have until you're confronted with having to think about them. And I'm not sure where I was going with that thought, because my mind is jumping around just the whole set of issues that most people go through. But yeah, so they do still fear the unknown, and most people have to realize what they had imagined to let go of what they've imagined. Then they can start imagining something new. Mm-hmm. And I think that's where the hope comes in.
Well, and what comes to mind, I'm sure that this comes up a lot in the work that you do, but what comes to mind is that for couples who've been struggling with infertility for quite some time, many couples begin to think about adoption and begin to kind of put forth that process, because of course it's not an easy process, it's a very lengthy process. And, with that in mind, this is not adoption, but there's similarities, obviously. So do you have any thoughts on the similarities between egg donation and actually adopting a child?
I think that there's a lot of similarity. I think that when people adopt children, they love them as their own, and they understand. I think it's just more obvious that when you're handed a child versus the year you have to kind of adjust to it and feel it. But after that initial relationship and bonding occurs, I don't think there's much difference at all. Quite honestly, I think, I was always open with my child. And I mentioned earlier that I just had to read some literature about what was the current thought on whether to tell a child or not. And this was back in the 80s, and it was still split about whether you even, open identity adoptions is fairly new. I had to decide, what was my story for my children? What was I going to tell them? Because they've actually met their egg donors, and
wow.
I just know that I wanted to introduce them age appropriately to the topic. And my birth story started off with, "You're really special. It took 3 people to make you instead of 2." And, I think it's everything is in the framing. And I learned that piece from adoption, reading some of the adoption literature. But I think, in most countries, because we do send donor eggs all around the world, we ship to Australia and Canada and the UK and all across the US and Peru and all sorts of places. So most other countries require donors to have open identity. So most of our donors are willing to share their information with the parents or the adult child that's conceived from her donation. I think it's at age 18 in most countries, but that's a piece of my company where we give patients photographs and the whole medical history. So they don't have to pull it out. We're not telling people to tell their children, but in 10 years, they might change their minds. And if they don't know the donor's identity, they don't have that option to share the information with their children. And gosh, I'm just so glad I did, because I just have come across situations where I would have looked like a deer in the headlights in front of my kids if I'd been asked that question without them knowing.
Hmm. Yeah, that's a hard conversation to have, and it's such an important topic to talk about when you're talking about egg donation.
Mm-hmm.
Because of course, in the initial stages, you're thinking about, can I conceive? Is this going to work? But then when you have your baby, thinking about 10, 20 years down the line, when your child starts asking questions, how you're going to approach those. And, one of the questions that came to mind as well as you were talking is availability. And so you did mention that you ship to, all around the world. So, what is it like then for a woman who, for whatever reason, decides that, egg donation is something that she wants to explore? Would you say that it's fairly straightforward to actually get eggs, or is it still a bit of a challenge for women who are wanting to go down this route?
I think it's pretty easy to do. We have thousands of eggs already frozen in our egg bank and another 400 donors waiting to donate. We even do altruistic donations. We have a selection of donors for Australia and the UK who only are reimbursed for expenses. 90% of our donors are open identity. You go to our theworldeggbank.com, you go to donors, you can look at photographs, 3 generations of medical history. Everything is free and online for people to look at. And I don't charge fees. I don't require people to fill out these registration forms or get permission from their doctors. You contact us with, "Hey, I'm interested in these donors." You begin working with our client representative. You select a donor. You can even just email or say, "This is the donor I want. How do I get started?" And we reach out to the fertility doctor that the patient is seeing. We let them know the patient has selected OVA, which they usually already know. And we arrange a shipping date. And, it depends on where the person is in their own treatment plan, but we can ship eggs out in, a week after a person has selected a donor off our website.
Wow.
So I try to make it as easy on people as I can.
Well, and you mentioned something about altruistic donors. So is that a sect of the donors? Are the rest of the donors compensated? Like, how does that work?
It's very hard to get that information anymore from other egg banks or other people that recruit donors, and ASRM has had to eliminate guidelines for fee payment because of a lawsuit in California a few years ago. But
I'm sorry, ASRM, could you?
Yes. The American Society of Reproductive Medicine, who establishes guidelines that we use across the U.S., and they're very similar to Canadian regulations. I'm very familiar with Canadian laws, and I travel there quite a bit. But in fact, I know one of your podcasts was with Dr. Dixon, and I've met with her a couple times there, and I just adore her, by the way.
Incredible.
Yeah, altruistic means that donors are reimbursed for expenses only. So they're donating their eggs because they are doing it just out of the goodness of their heart. But however, a lot of the reimbursements for donors in the U.S. can go up to $10,000. When I have U.S. donors for the U.S. clients, because it's very hard to recruit 400 altruistic donors, but we can generally get about 100 out of that. So the other ones are paid much less, about a third of what most other clinics and agencies are paying their donors. And I do that intentionally because I don't want people to be motivated or coerced by the money. I also know my egg donors, and I had went through the process with them from their perspective. So a lot of what we do is also geared towards really taking good care of our egg donors. So we're just starting on a similar level if we're not talking that it's all about money.
Mm-hmm. And it's like, where does the rabbit hole go? But so you have egg donors. So does that mean that there's certain donors that you that regularly donate eggs?
Well, we still stick by the guideline that the American Society of Reproductive Medicine established of up to 6 donations, but I would say most donors donate 2 or 3 times. And partly it just depends on how well they do in terms of if they're just really fertile and they have a lot of eggs, I can only use them a few times because we also follow worldwide family limits. So we follow regulations in Australia that there can only be 10 families worldwide from one donor.
Oh, wow. That's really the ethics around that and the laws. That's interesting. Now, this is just a curiosity question. Is there a reason why they have those limits? Like, is there an actual reason?
Well, yes and no. It's sort of like a lot of the laws in our country. Was a reason, and it's not really doesn't really get to the reason, but it's something called consanguinity, which means that in a certain population base, you want to minimize to quite a small number the possibility of one donor child meeting another donor child and having a child from the same donors. But it's such a remote, I can see that was probably significant in the early days of sperm donation when it was pretty indiscriminate about how many families were being born. But egg donors, only have, 6 couples maximum if they donate 3 times that these eggs go to, and 55% of them get pregnant. So you're only talking about a couple of kids. Even if they're twins, it's within the same family. So the chances of a child being born from a donor egg meeting another child being born from a donor egg is certainly much smaller than 10 families worldwide. But that's just how the government decided to interpret consanguinity.
And is that, so last question along these lines, like, because I feel like I remember seeing like an Oprah episode where it was more than 10, but it was sperm donation. Is it the same with sperm donation? Or do you know?
No, sperm donors, yes, it is in Australia. There is a limit, and I'm really not sure because I kind of just work with eggs, but I know that there are some, I don't even think there are family limits on sperm donors in the U.S., but don't quote me on that. I have to look at it.
Like, I feel like I remember seeing this episode.
Yeah.
It was like this guy, and he had donated like for years, and he had like 50 kids or something like that. He didn't, right? There were like 50 children from this guy. Anyway, that's a totally different. But that's a whole different topic, because then I'm kind of like, well, why is it different for women and all that kind of stuff. But I feel like you've given us a really interesting window into egg donation. And I'm not sure if you know, but I interviewed Heidi Hayes, and she's the CEO of Donor Egg Bank USA. And so for any of the listeners who are, tuning into this because they're considering egg donation or because they just want more information about all of that, I would definitely suggest for them to go back and listen to that episode as well, episode 88, because it's very, I don't know, I would imagine that it's an area where you really have to search for information and you really have to take it upon yourself. As you were talking about at the beginning of the call, to really take the reins and to really find that information. I think it's also very interesting that you mentioned that if someone, is able to select a donor and kind of come into contact with World Egg Bank, that they can have eggs within like a week or a couple weeks. So it's not even something that necessarily takes a long time. Like, I can order a t-shirt from Old Navy in the same time I can.
I know. It's hard to sort of it's just the truth now,
Yeah.
It's really much simpler. And I think it's almost scary for people because they expect it to be much harder and they're wondering what's wrong because it's so easy. But we've given this a lot of thought, and I've been doing this since 2004. So our systems are really been finely tuned. And I've always done it from the perspective of a recipient and a donor. And that's all we do. We don't do anything else. So our goal is to make it seem almost too good to be true.
Well, so for the woman listening who has been thinking about egg donation or is just tuning in for information because this is just something she's never really thought of and she's just trying to get more information, just in general, what do you want her to take away from our conversation today?
I think it is, I would say, don't just focus on the egg donor because we get really attached to picking an egg donor that we can relate to, that is like us, or that you really have to look at also how you can reassure yourself that this is the best quality egg, not just the best egg donor.
Mm-hmm.
I think a lot of people get stuck on the picture of the donor and are really not considering how can I get the best quality eggs so that my chances are the best to have a child.
Yeah, interesting. Yeah, I could see that because it's this emotional decision looking at a person's picture. And I guess along those same lines, the thought that came up in my mind is, what's the average age or the typical age for your egg donors?
The average age is about 24, and we have donors from very mature donors from 19 to 29-year-old donors.
And so you have kind of a top limit, like a hard cutoff?
Yes. And I say that with only one caveat, which is we have a very difficult time recruiting Asian, East Indian, and Jewish donors. And we will accept an Asian donor if she's done well on one cycle. We will take her until she's up to 32.
Just because of the difficulty in obtaining eggs from.
Right.
Interesting.
There are just different cultural beliefs around it, and we have a very hard time recruiting those three particular ethnic groups.
Well, yes, no, that's very interesting and interesting advice as well to kind of take it away from like, what does the picture look like to the actual egg quality.
Right.
Well, Dana, it has been a pleasure talking to you. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your personal experience with infertility and just really giving us a sense of what drove you to jump into the field of egg donation. It's incredible to think also that your challenging experience, like this is what came out of it. One of the things that I love about doing these interviews is, often the people I'm interviewing have had different challenges in their lives, whether they're professionals in their field, health professionals, or like in your case, founding the world's first egg bank. And so I think it's really just incredible to think that you took such a potentially negative and challenging situation and turned it into something so positive for so many women.
Well, I appreciate that. Thank you so much. I guess that's been my perspective on life, turning lemon into lemonade.
Well, you certainly did. Well, thank you again for being on the show.
Thank you very much. Thanks for the time.
So for the listeners who want to learn more about World Egg Bank, they want to learn more about what you do, and they, perhaps for the listener who actually wants to really seriously look into it, where can the listeners go to get more information about what you do?
We have a very easy to navigate website called theworldegybank.com. There is a contact us form on there where you just write us what you want or tell us to call you, or you can phone us at 602, it's +1 602 678 1906, or you can specifically email Tonya, Tonya, at theworldegybank.com.
Okay, perfect. And I will include all of those links on the show notes page if you're on the go, so you don't have to worry about remembering those right now.
Oh, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed today's show, please share it with a friend. You'll find the show notes page for today's episode at fertilityfriday.com/196. I hope that you enjoyed my interview with Diana. It was a great opportunity to be able to talk to her about her own personal experience and her journey with fertility challenges, but also what drove her to create the World Egg Bank. And so it's really crazy to think that you can literally go online and essentially order eggs and have access to them within, a week or two, depending on where you're at in your fertility journey. But I think it's really helpful to know that that is an option. And so if this is a topic that interests you, more information about IVF, about artificial reproductive technology, more information even about the actual success rate. So that's something that I've talked about on the show with a number of guests, meaning the difference between the pregnancy rate if you have an IVF procedure done or any other type of fertility treatment versus the live birth rate. I mean, obviously we want to have the baby in the end. So we really want to pay attention to the statistics. And another important topic that has come up regarding statistics is how, a woman's age impacts the success rate. And so, whether it's with IVF, whether it's with natural conception, whether it is with any other type of procedure, I know I've done a few episodes on IUI, intrauterine insemination, and, the chances of a pregnancy, a successful pregnancy and a live birth definitely decline as you get older. And so the interesting aspect of donor eggs is that you have the ability to increase your chances of a successful conception and a successful delivery, especially if you find yourself at advanced maternal age. So especially if you find yourself, in that age range, late 30s, early 40s. So it's more just about providing access to just, what options are available to you, and really to let you jump into that driver's seat and decide what's going to work best for you. So if this topic particularly interests you, there's a couple of episodes I will suggest that you take a look at. So one is episode number 88. And that I mentioned that in the podcast. That is an episode that I recorded with Heidi Hayes, who is the founder of Donor Egg Bank USA. And so in that episode, one of the things that she really talked about was kind of that thorough screening process that Diana talked about in this interview as well, which is how they choose the donors and how they're screened, and to give you a sense of just the lengths that they go through to ensure the quality of the eggs. And in that episode as well, she also talked about the preservation of eggs and why it's important to kind of pay attention to where you're getting them from and all of those types of things. So I think it's, again, very interesting and important information if this is something that you're considering. A couple other episodes that you'll want to check out, again, if you're interested about this topic. One of the first episodes that I recorded, so episode number 11. So you'll find each episode that I record, it's fertilityfriday.com/ and then the number of the episode. So that would be fertilityfriday.com/11. And then the previous would be fertilityfriday.com/88. But in episode number 11, I interviewed Dr. Mel McDowell. And, that was just such an eye-opening episode because, again, she really talked about the impact of aging and fertility and just really took us into a discussion of the realities of aging. I think that's something that as women, it's just not what we're taught. It kind of starts with being told that we're fertile every day and that, the best birth control is one that is hormonal and that prevents pregnancy all the time. And it leaves us with the impression that, we'll all get pregnant on a drop of a dime just without it even trying on every day of our cycle. And so it leaves us with the impression that it'll be just as easy for us to get pregnant at the age of 35 as it will at the age of 19. And statistically and scientifically, it's just not the case. Our fertility does change as we get older. And so that episode is a really good one to look at. Another episode that I would like to direct you to is episode 109, and that was with Dr. Marjorie Dixon. In that episode, Dr. Dixon is a fertility doctor located in Toronto, Ontario. And if you've been listening to the podcast for a while, then you'll, have heard of her and you may have listened to the podcast already. But if you're new to the podcast, that's a good one to listen to as well, because she gets into some of those statistics and really getting it at the idea of how aging impacts fertility. So lots of great episodes to check out if this topic interests you. And I'll link all of those episodes I mentioned on the show notes page for this episode. And so I just want to thank you, again, for taking the time to listen to today's episode. And of course, a special shout out to the show sponsor, Dow Labs. Make sure to head over to mydowlabs.com. That's mydaolabs.com for more information. And don't forget to use the coupon code Fertility for 20% off of your first order. And make sure to head over to fertilityfriday.com/fam101 to get your copy of my free 3-part video series all about fertility awareness. I know you're going to love it. So if you haven't had a chance to grab that, make sure to head over there and get your hot little hands on your copy. And I just want to thank you so much for spending the time with me today, for listening to the show and supporting the show. I really do appreciate all of you for tuning in week after week, joining me every Friday or, whichever day you're listening to the show. I really appreciate it. It's because of all of you. It's because of this incredible community that has formed over the past 3 years that I continue podcasting. I really enjoy interacting with all of you and connecting with all of you in the Fertility Friday Facebook group. So if you're not part of the Fertility Friday Facebook group, you can always head over to fertilityfriday.com/community for your invitation to join us in the Facebook group, where we'll be talking about today's topics. And I always pose some interesting questions in there to spark some really interesting discussions. So we have a lot of really interesting discussions about fertility awareness and fertility and various topics related to that. So if you're not in there, I'm sure you'll want to join us in there. And we'll be talking about today's episode as well. So just want to thank you for listening. Really appreciate all of you for supporting the show, for being part of the community. I couldn't do this without all of you, so I really, really appreciate you. And of course, until next time, be well and happy charting.